Hi, today I'm talking about Dorothy Kilgallen, who was a famous journalist, radio and TV star who died in 1965 at the age of 52. Dorothy Kilgallen was an American newspaper columnist, Pulitzer Prize nominated investigative journalist, and television game show panelist. She was born Dorothy May Kilgallen on the 3rd of July 1913 in Chicago, Illinois, to newspaper reporter James Lawrence Kilgallen and May Kilgallen, whose maiden name was Ahern. She was of Irish descent. She had a sister, Eleanor, who was born in 1919. The family settled in Brooklyn, New York, when her father got a job at the International News Service in New York. She attended the College of New Rochelle, but then left when she got a job as a reporter for the New York Evening Journal. The newspaper was owned by the Hearst Corporation, William Randolph Hearst's company. The company also owned International News Service, who employed her father. In October 1936, at the age of 23, Dorothy participated in a competition with two other New York newspaper reporters in a race around the world. They could only use public transportation. She was the only woman to take part, and she achieved second place. She wrote a book called Girl Around the World about the adventure. The 1937 movie Fly Away Baby, starring Glenda Farrell, was made using her trip as the basis of the story. The female character in the movie is a reporter who competes in a race around the world as she and her detective boyfriend try to solve a murder and diamond smuggling case. In 1938, Dorothy began writing The Voice of Broadway, which was a daily column for Hearst's New York Journal American. She wrote it up until her death in 1965. It was about New York show business news and gossip, but she would also write about politics and crime. Her column was syndicated to over 100 newspapers, so Dorothy became famous. In 1940, Dorothy married Richard Colmar, who was a musical comedy actor and singer who starred in Broadway shows. They had 3 children: Richard, known as Dickie, who was born in 1941, Jill, born in 1943, and a son called Kerry, born in 1954. Notice Kerry was born 11 years after Jill. Apparently Dorothy and Richard's marriage had run its course, but they remained married for business reasons and for the children. They both had other partners. Author Mark Shaw, in his book The Reporter Who Knew Too Much, states that Kerry was singer Johnny Ray's son. After Dorothy's death in 1965, Richard disowned Kerry around 1969 or 1970 when he was 15 or 16 years old. In a video recording, Dorothy's hairdresser, Mark Sinclair, said Dorothy had told him that Johnny Ray was Kerry's father. Johnny was born in 1927, making him 14 years her junior. He was also bisexual. Here is Johnny with actress Mitzi Gaynor in 1954. In 1945, Dorothy and Richard broadcast a weekday radio talk show called Breakfast with Dorothy and Dick from their 16-room apartment at 640 Park Avenue. They later bought a townhouse at 45 East 68th Street in 1952. They continued the radio show until 1963 from their home. A TV show called Person to Person had host Edward R. Murrow interview people in their homes. Dorothy and her husband did an interview with him. Their house was very grand, and they had a drawing room, which was somewhere to completely relax, which had no television set, no radio, and even no electricity, only candlelight. In the interview, Dorothy said she had loved covering Queen Elizabeth II's coronation at Westminster Abbey. Dorothy became a panellist on a new TV game show called What's My Line in 1950. Members of the public would appear and the panellists had to guess what their jobs were. The show won an Emmy in 1953 for the category of Best Audience Participation Quiz or Panel Programme. She appeared on the very first live show. The programme, which was broadcast from New York City on the CBS television network, was hugely popular and ran for 17 years until 1967. Dorothy appeared on it nearly every Sunday night for 15 years until her death. It started off being filmed in front of a live audience. Later, when videotape was invented, some of the episodes were taped and then broadcast. I've recently discovered this show on YouTube. It's amazing. It's a time capsule of the 1950s and 1960s. All the panellists were smartly dressed in cocktail dresses and suits. Even the members of the public on the show were dressed in their best clothes. The nameplates in front of the panellists had the titles of Miss and Mr. After the ladies' and men's jobs have been guessed or revealed, they walk over to the panellists and shake their hands. It is such class and style. Each show had a mystery guest, which was somebody famous. The panellists had to cover their eyes with masks, and in the later programmes, the mystery guest would try to disguise their voices. They had the top movie stars and sports stars of the day on the show. Betty Davis, Gloria Swanson, Tony Curtis, Jane Mansfield, Joe DiMaggio, Olivia de Havilland, Lana Turner, Barbra Streisand, Sammy Davis Jr., Elizabeth Taylor, Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers, Lucille Ball. Journalist and radio and television personality John Charles Daly was the host and moderator. I was shocked when I saw him light up a cigarette in the middle of the programme. We aren't used to that, but it must have been what happened on TV in the 1950s. Actress and radio and TV talk show host Arlene Francis was a regular panellist on the show. She appeared from the second episode until the show's cancellation in 1967. She also appeared on the revival of the show from 1968 to 1975. In 1960, when Arlene, her husband and son were on holiday in Connecticut, her maid shampooed the carpet. The maid opened the windows to get rid of the smell of the shampoo, but she used one of Arlene's dumbbells to hold one of the windows open. The dumbbell fell from their 8th floor Ritz Tower apartment and hit a Detroit man on the head who was walking past. He was killed. His widow sued Arlene for $185,000. In 1963, when Arlene was driving to the Manhattan studio to film the live broadcast of What's My Line, her car was struck by another car, which propelled her car into another car carrying 5 passengers. One of the people died. Arlene suffered a broken collarbone and concussion. She wore a heart-shaped diamond pendant around her neck on nearly all of the appearances on What's My Line. It was a gift from her second husband, producer and actor Martin Gable. A mugger grabbed the necklace when she was walking in New York City in 1988, breaking the chain. Arlene was 80 years old at the time, and she'd been wearing it for over 40 years, as it was a first wedding anniversary present. Bennett Cerf, who was a writer, publisher, and the co-founder of publishing firm Random House, was also a regular panellist. His second wife was actress Phyllis Fraser, who was a cousin of dancer and actress Ginger Rogers. American poet Louis Undermeyer was on the show during its first year. According to Bennett Cerf, Louis wasn't a communist, but he accidentally signed some papers and joined some societies that caused him to be named at the House Committee of Un-American Activities hearings. People protested that he was on the show, and he ended up being fired and blacklisted by the television industry. He became seriously depressed about being fired from the show and didn't leave his home in Brooklyn for more than a year, according to playwright Arthur Miller. Hal Block was one of the early panelists on the show. He was a comedy writer. He was fired after 3 years on the show because there was criticism due to his sexual innuendos, and he was accused of leering at the female guests. His humour livened up the show, and some people give him credit for the show's early success. In an episode in March 1952, an 86-year-old lady was one of the guests. She seemed confused after having signed in, which involved signing her name in chalk on a blackboard. Hal jumped up and escorted her to her seat next to the host, John Charles Daly. Also in this episode, when the lady, Winifred Brodie, who would have been born in either 1865 or 1866, depending on when her birthday was, came over to the panel at the end of her segment to shake their hands, which was commonplace. Dorothy stood up. Normally when the guests shook the panelists' hands, the men stood up and the women remained seated. Back to Dorothy's journalism career. She reported on high-profile cases. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas on the 22nd of November 1963. Dorothy knew the president, and so she wanted to investigate his assassination. Lee Harvey Oswald was deemed his killer. She didn't believe that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. Nightclub owner Jack Ruby then killed Lee Harvey Oswald by shooting him 2 days later. Jack Ruby's lawyer was Melvin Belli. He had lots of celebrity clients. When it was Jack's trial, Dorothy was the only reporter who got an interview with Jack. According to Joe Tonnahill, Melvin Belli's co-counsel, she interviewed him during the noon recess. Dorothy then published Jack Ruby's testimony on the front page of the New York Journal-American newspaper before the president had received it. The head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, was furious about this, and he sent a couple of FBI agents to question Dorothy at her home to find out who her source was. She refused to tell them how she had got it. J. Edgar Hoover's stance was Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. In this article, she is commenting on the Warren Commission's findings that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, and she writes, "At any rate, the whole thing smells a bit fishy." A 2007 article was written in Midwest Today called "Who Killed Dorothy Kilgallen?" In this article, there was evidence from Dorothy's 2 hairdressers about what she was doing in 1965. Author Mark Shaw was able to obtain the hairdressers' videotaped interviews that happened sometime in the late 1990s and early 2000s. He has put them all on a website called the DorothyKilgallenStory.org. Dorothy went to New Orleans to investigate JFK's assassination. Mobster Carlos Marcello resided in New Orleans. Her hairdresser and close friend Mark Sinclair accompanied her on that trip. When John F. Kennedy became president in 1961, he appointed his brother Robert Kennedy as Attorney General. Once Robert was in power, he went after the mafia. The main gangster he went after was Carlos Marcello. In April 1961, Robert Kennedy got Carlos deported to Guatemala. He managed to get back to the United States of America shortly afterwards. Here he is. When Dorothy got back from New Orleans, she told people that there were various people involved in the assassination, not just one. This was going to be her big exposé. She was planning a second trip to New Orleans, but she never made it. All her papers and documents from her investigation disappeared after her death. She had been planning to write it in a book and have Random House publish it. Random House was her TV co-panelist Bennett Cerf's company. She told her hairdresser Mark that she was going to get a gun because her life had been threatened and she was fearful for herself and her family. Her youngest child, Kerry, had been photographed alone in Central Park, which showed someone was watching him, and Dorothy was worried he might be kidnapped. She drew up a new will to make sure that Kerry would have money because she didn't think Richard, her husband, would look after him. That implies that Kerry wasn't his son. In 1978, the House Select Committee on Assassinations concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby were connected to Carlos Marcello's crime organization. The committee found that Carlos Marcello had the motive, means, and opportunity to have John F. Kennedy assassinated. On Sunday the 7th of November 1965, Dorothy filmed her last What's My Line show, which was a live broadcast. Mark, her hairdresser, got her ready for the show. However, Dorothy changed her dress. The dress she was wearing on the show wasn't the one she was wearing when Mark helped her get ready. She was wearing a chiffon cocktail dress by American fashion designer Anne Fogarty. After her death, Dorothy's husband married Anne in 1967. How bizarre. On the panel was Dorothy, actor Tony Randall, Arlene Francis and Bennett Cerf. The first guest was Spoonie Singh from Hollywood, who owned the Hollywood Wax Museum. The next guest was Catherine Stone from Madisonville, Kentucky, whose job was selling dynamite. Bennett Cerf asked if the product she dealt with was dangerous. He got a yes. He then asked if it was some sort of firearm, in which he got a no. So the questioning passed to Dorothy, and she correctly guessed it was dynamite. When asked what she thought the guest did with dynamite, she again correctly guessed that she sold it. The mystery guest was singer and actress Joey Heatherton. The last guest was Eleanor Kane from New York City, who was a football writer. Dorothy guessed correctly that she was a writer. Dorothy was as alert, bright, sharp as she'd always been on the show. She didn't appear drunk or drugged. Here is the panel on the 15th anniversary of the show in 1965, the year of Dorothy's death. After the TV show, Catherine the Dynamite Lady and Spoonie Singh went to the Regency Hotel. Catherine saw Dorothy at the hotel with a mystery man. They were seated together and in deep conversation. According to Mark Shaw, who wrote the book The Reporter Who Knew Too Much, witnesses said that she was at the hotel until about 2 a.m. Mark went round to Dorothy's townhouse at 45 East 68th Street in Manhattan, which was a 5-story Georgian mansion, later that morning before 9 a.m. He found her sitting up in bed in a bedroom she didn't use on the 3rd floor of her house. He touched her and realised that she was dead. She still had her makeup on, her false eyelashes on, her hairpiece on, and her hair accessory, which was still in her hair, that she had in her hair on the show. This was unusual for Dorothy, as she would take her makeup and her false eyelashes off. The light was on, and also was the air conditioning. As this was November in New York, air conditioning wasn't required. Having the heating on was more appropriate, but maybe the killer was the one that put it on to preserve the body. A book, The Honey Badger by Robert Ruark, was on the bed, but it was upside down, and her reading glasses weren't there. Mark said that she had finished reading that book a few weeks before. There was a drink on the table. But then there's the story that Dorothy's butler, James Clement, found her body first in the 3rd floor bathroom. She was still wearing the cocktail dress that she had worn the night before. He apparently told this to his wife and daughter. Then someone moved the body from the bathroom to the bedroom. Someone had also changed her clothing, and she was dressed in a peignoir, which is a long sheer garment made from chiffon or another translucent fabric. Then Mark found her body in the bedroom. Mark thought that what she was wearing was something that she wouldn't normally wear to bed. Mark left the townhouse and noticed that there was a police car with police officers inside, outside Dorothy's house. The authorities weren't called until the afternoon. During the interim, FBI agents came into the home and took Dorothy's files and papers away with them. The medical examiner stated she had died from an overdose of barbiturates and alcohol. He said her death was accidental and the circumstances were undetermined. Her 2 hairdressers said that she didn't have an alcohol problem or a drug problem. Charles Simpson, Dorothy's other hairdresser, said he didn't believe she had killed herself because she was looking forward to a trip to London the next day. He also said in the taped interview, Dorothy said that if the wrong people knew what she had found out, it would cost her her life. Charles also said that both him and Mark had their phones tapped. Even though the death scene looked staged, there was no investigation. Years later, it was discovered that there were actually 3 different barbiturates in Dorothy's system: Siconol, Turinol, and Nembutal. Also, there had been loose powder in the glass, which points to someone emptying the contents of pills into Dorothy's glass. Here is Dorothy at the White House with President Truman in 1946. On the back row, 3rd from the left, is actress Angela Lansbury. Sitting next to the president is child star Margaret O'Brien. In the front row, kneeling, is Dorothy, 2nd from the right. At the time of her death, Dorothy had been dating a reporter named Ron Pataki. They had met in June 1964 on a European press junket that was paid for by 20th Century Fox to publicise 3 of its films: The Sound of Music, The Agony and the Ecstasy, and Those Magnificent Men in Their Flying Machines. He was born in 1935, so he was 30 years old and Dorothy was 52. They would meet at the Regency Hotel, so he could have been the man with Dorothy on her final night at the hotel. Dorothy discussed her suspicions with Mark that Ron was leaking the information she had found out about JFK's assassination. So who was he working for? The Mafia? The CIA? The FBI? Dorothy's mother seemed to think Dorothy's husband Richard was responsible for her death. Dorothy ended up being the breadwinner of the family. He was a kept husband at the time of her death. He also had a drinking problem. Did he accidentally give Dorothy too many pills with her alcoholic drink? If it had been an accident or deliberately done, wouldn't he have placed her in the correct bedroom? He knew she wore reading glasses, and so along with the book, wouldn't he have placed her reading glasses on the bed? Some reports state Richard committed suicide on the 7th of January 1971 at the age of 60 via an overdose just over 5 years after her death. However, there was a report in the New York Times that said he had broken his shoulder in a fall and had died of a heart attack. Ron Pataki wrote 2 disturbing and revealing poems after Dorothy's death. One of the poems is entitled "Never Trust a Stiff at a Typewriter," which has the lines, "There's a way to quench a gossip's stench that never fails, one cannot write if zippered tight. Somebody who's dead could tell no tales." The second poem is called "Vodka Roulette Seen as Relief Possibility," which has the lines, "While I'm spilling my guts, she is driving me nuts. Please fetch us 2 drinks on the run. Just skip all the noise and make one of them poison, and don't even tell me which one." When author Mark Shaw interviewed Ron for his book, he said the poems were humorous. Humorous? How are they funny? They seem to be a confession. He knew how she died, so he was either directly involved or knew who killed her. He died on the 16th of May 2022, a few days before his 87th birthday. She didn't have much luck with men, did she? Her marriage ended up being in name only. Johnny Ray didn't work out. And then there was this Ron character. Dorothy is buried in the Gate of Heaven Cemetery, 10 West Stevens Avenue, Hawthorne, Westchester County, New York, in Section 23, Lot 121, Grave 6. So what do you think about that? Don't forget to watch What's My Line on YouTube. It's amazing. If you like this video, please like, share, subscribe, press the notification bell, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.